BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And just a quick reminder, every Monday is Zodiac Mondays. Wednesday is an Ask Me Anything. That's an AMA, so please drop your questions below for things that you would like discussed here on the show. And Friday is an Anything Goes. Any subject is fair game, mostly talking about true crime, serial killers, the Zodiac Killer, but any subject is welcome. All right, so please share some ideas in the comment section about what you would like to hear about on this channel, and let's get started. Alright, hello everybody. Today is Friday, and Anything Goes Friday, where any subject is fair game. And today we're going back to 1983 to discuss the story of Bruce Lisker, as well as, of course, the person you see here in the title, Dorka Lisker, his mother who lost her life in that year. Bruce Lisker was then in prison for 26 years, and the question that people were just asking over and over again was he actually guilty? I recently completed the Paramount Plus show Interrogation, which you can find on that streaming service, although it is a little bit older now, and I was talking a lot about this on the Instagram journal. Now's a great time to follow BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for that bonus podcast I always talk about. I say a lot about Paramount Plus, not only Interrogation, but the other content. But Interrogation is a show that is based on a true story, and I'll try my best not to reveal any spoilers in case anyone wants to check it out for themselves. And in the television show, Bruce Lisker is given a fictional name, Eric Fisher, and his mother, Mary Fisher, is based on the real-life Dorka Lisker. So, after watching that show, I just really wanted to know what was the actual story that happened. What were the real events that inspired this television show? And there's an episode of 48 Hours out about the case, which we will be discussing in this episode, as well as numerous articles and even some things from Bruce Lisker's own website. But yes, back in 1983, Dorka Lisker lost her life. And to help us out with an introduction, I'm going to go over to the University of Michigan website. They actually have something called the National Registry for Exonerations. And let's have a read. On March 10th, 1983, 66-year-old Dorka Lisker was beaten with a Little League trophy and then stabbed in the back with a pair of steak knives in her home in Sherman Oaks, California. Paramedics were summoned to the scene at 11:26 a.m. by Dorka's adopted son Bruce. She was then taken to the hospital where she died around 3 p.m. Bruce claimed that when his mother didn't answer the door, he went into the backyard, looked through a window into the living room, and saw her on the floor. He said he removed the lowered panes of glass from the window. Those are like the panes of glass that can open and shut, but there's like a stack of them all up and down. The panes of glass. He removed the panes of glass from the window, entered the house, and found his mother bleeding on the floor, unconscious but alive. He said he pulled the 2 steak knives from her back and called the paramedics. Okay, keep going. Detectives Andrew Monsu and Howard Landgren arrived at the scene of the crime. Monsu, who questioned Bruce, immediately suspected the 17-year-old Bruce had committed the crime himself. Bruce had a history of drug addiction. In fact, he was high on methamphetamine when he called the paramedics, and he had an extremely contentious relationship with his mother. He also had been previously convicted of vandalism for throwing a screwdriver at someone who had cut him off while driving. Authorities suspected that Dorka had caught Bruce stealing money from her purse in order to buy drugs, and that Bruce had killed her in a subsequent struggle. And these theories are discussed frequently throughout the show Interrogation on Paramount Plus. Or, as I said, though, they did change all of the names of the people who were involved. But I was really impressed with the show that they held on to many of these actual events that have been put in place. I mean, the timeline, the activities, the murder weapons, all of this seems rather consistent with the real-life events that we were just hearing about right there. There's one point, though, that I noticed in some other sources, particularly that 48 Hours episode that talks about how every step of this is going to be important. Like, every footstep that Bruce Lisker took that day is a clue in itself. And one thing that it seems to be missing here in this University of Michigan, this is the, what do we say, National Registry for Exonerations page. One thing that they seem to have left out is the first thing he did was he went to that window at his mother's home. He looked in, and it appeared that he could see her feet on the floor as if she had been laying on the floor of the house. But so then he goes to another window, which is actually the dining room window, and then looks in, and then he sees, yes, indeed, his mother is on the floor, and it appears that she is severely injured or that she cannot get up. And that's when he removes the glass and then gets into her house and then removes the pair of steak knives. As I was watching that during the show Interrogation, I noticed that immediately he's taking the knives out and of her, and you're thinking, oh, he's going to have his fingerprints all over everything. He's going to have her blood all over his clothes. But, I mean, it's a reaction. There really isn't a manual on how to deal with life, and a lot of people do not really know what they're going to be experiencing once they find a family member in a situation of crisis. Multiple times throughout the show Interrogation, though, this is the dramatization, that is, he was saying, the character that's based on Bruce Lisker, that he took the knives out of his mother's back so that she could breathe. But in terms of the actual narrative that happened, the detective we were just talking about, named Andrew Monsu, is given the fictional name of Dave Russell in the show Interrogation. And from the beginning, it appears that this guy, Andrew Monsu, wanted to vilify Bruce Lisker, and even throughout the show, whether it's 48 Hours or Paramount Plus Interrogation, they didn't completely share the reason why. Did he just get tunnel vision and have this guy in his sights? Was he following a first instinct and was refusing to back down? Was he refusing to admit that maybe he had the wrong person, or did he simply want to close the case and showed indifference to Bruce Lisker? But he definitely did not waver from the standpoint that he had taken, and this appears to happen a lot. And there also are police cover-ups or people hiding evidence. And I'm not saying anything about Andrew Monsu in this exact instance, but in other cases that you can look into, you'll definitely find examples of people who are trying to close a case for various reasons, so then they want to move on to other things, or perhaps they also have some other reasons why they want to divert from other suspects. But in regards to the show Interrogation, they went through many different theories. And as someone who follows a lot of true crime cases, I always like it when these crime shows play out the different theories and scenarios with visual imagery, and they show you what would it look like if the person committed this crime this way, or even better, if an alternative suspect is proposed, how would it have happened? Because there is something that is quite odd about the murder of Dorka Lisker, and that is that numerous weapons are involved. It's not only the two knives that were found in her back. Firstly, there was a blunt force strike that came from a Little League baseball trophy that had been used to strike her. And in some sources, they cite one thing that was definitely featured in the Paramount Plus show, and that is that there were two items that were used for blunt force. The second one was an exercise bar, and reading a couple other articles, I haven't found anything that would indicate the final fifth weapon, which was a piece of like a cord-like rope. I mean, almost similar to a bungee cord, but not quite that sturdy. So like the piece of cord. So two knives, and then the baseball trophy, the exercise bar, and then the piece of cord. 5 different weapons are being used in this instance. And is that significant of a single perpetrator? Because I don't want to give away any spoilers, and I don't think that this does. But with the true story, if this is going to take place, then they go through the scenario. Does that not suggest that there was more than one person in the house if you're going to have 2 weapons that were used for blunt force? But very simply, examining different theories, you could just as easily make an interpretation of the evidence that would say that there was first someone is trying to strike somebody with the Little League trophy, and that is an insufficient weapon, so then they would grab something much sturdier like the exercise bar, and then they would try to finish somebody off and stab them with the pair of steak knives. But if Bruce Lisker did not commit this crime, then who did? In the show Interrogation, they heavily highlighted a particular suspect whose fictional name on the show was Chris Keller, and he is the his real life counterpart is named John Michael Ryan, commonly known as Mike. I did not find this in any of the supporting documents, but I expect that they gave him the name Chris Keller for the TV show because Keller sounds like killer, but that's just my hunch or suspicion. Now, John Michael Ryan was somebody whom had met Bruce Lisker at a drug rehabilitation program. He had a history of violent tendencies. He had a history of using knives on people, threatening people with knives, assaults. So he had a violent temper, and he was also known to commit violent crimes with knives. And John Michael Ryan was going back and forth between Gulfport, Mississippi, and California. Once again, this happened in Sherman Oaks. And there's also accounts of him breaking into a woman's home. There's also an account of him assaulting somebody with a knife around that time. I mean, he becomes a very likely suspect in the murder of Dorka Lisker. Is that beyond a reasonable doubt? Well, let's keep going. I have just one more thing that I would like to read from this University of Michigan post, and then we will move on, but it talks about John Michael Ryan, and it said that he had visited the house the day before the murder, asking to be hired to do chores. I mean, they got to get money somehow. Bruce knew Ryan from drug counseling. Bruce had sometimes allowed Ryan to sleep on his couch, but Bruce had kicked him out in January of 1983. And as you heard from the beginning of this post, this took place in March of 1983. Monsu found Ryan in a youth detention facility in Gulfport, Mississippi. He had been convicted for trying to break into a woman's home. Ryan said that he arrived in Los Angeles from Gulfport on March 6th. He said that he had gone to the Lisker home on March 9th asking to use the phone and to do some chores. He said that Dorka had invited him in and gave him a drink of water, but she didn't hire him to do chores, so he left. He said that on March 10th he checked into a motel in Hollywood at 11 a.m. He took a bus to Gulfport on March 11th. So as we said, going back and forth between Gulfport, Mississippi and California. However, though, that becomes the big question that's mentioned in the show. It's mentioned in 48 Hours. It's mentioned perhaps everywhere across the planet Earth. How did he get the money for the motel if all of a sudden, it is all of a sudden if he doesn't have any money at all and he's having to do chores for people just to earn basic amounts of drug money? How does he have the money to pay for this type of motel? So that is another red flag. If you ever do watch the Paramount Plus show Interrogation, it is a show that I've never really encountered before. I mean, I've never encountered one like it before. And you can watch the first episode, and then they say, watch the episodes in any order that you want, because it's a non-linear story. But you have to watch the final episode last. There's something on it that says watch last. So they presented the angle in some of the episodes that are meant to be earlier in the timeline, that it had to have been this guy, Chris Keller, or John Michael Ryan. Chris Keller, once again, is his fictionalized name, but it had to have been John Michael Ryan because of all of these things that seem suspicious around him. But as we said later on, then they're going to introduce this theory that why not multiple participants? If you have different weapons being used, whether it's the knives, the baseball trophy, the exercise bar, even if it's just the trophy and the knives, doesn't that suggest that there was more than one person in the house? And I'm not suggesting that. That is a question that they asked in the show. I can give a response to that question at the end. But right now, I would like to go over to an article from dailynews.com. Dorka Lisker was beaten and stabbed and died on the floor of her home. Her then 17-year-old son reported finding her body when he went to the house to borrow a tool. Prosecutors said Lisker could not have seen his mother on the floor, and that he had his mother's blood on his clothes, that he confessed to a jailhouse informant, and his bloody shoe prints were the only prints found at the scene. Now, because this is a channel where we talk about a lot of true crime cases, a big point that I did not hear emphasized in the show is that just because someone does not leave bloody footprints in the house does not mean that they were not there. I mean, people can commit crimes without leaving bloody footprints. I mean, it has been done before, but I don't want to go off on a giant tangent talking about someone else's true crime story, but maybe we will discuss that on Wednesday's AMA. I mean, it's called being careful. I mean, it's called trying not to step in the blood, and that has definitely been done before, but in the event that Bruce Lisker is innocent, you just got to imagine, I mean, looking through the window and finding your mother on the floor, and then you find that she's been stabbed with 2 knives. Utterly horrible, utterly horrible. But there's a big piece of evidence that was put forward by that detective, Andrew Monsu, who really wanted to vilify Bruce Lisker, and that is that he could not have seen into the house through that window because it had a reflectant, it had a glare. The light from the sun would reflect off the window, and in short, it would be impossible to have seen through the window. It couldn't be done. But the 48 Hours investigative crew, as well as many other people before that, but that's just the first place that I saw it in real life, showed that was just a blatant falsehood. It was incorrect information, and it was somewhat dishonest. So that was another strike against the authorities, and also a strike against Andrew Monsu. And there's also something about him to share, so please stay until the end. But let's keep going in this Daily News article. The Times investigation found that he could have seen his mother through the window. The blood could have gotten on his clothes when he went to her aid. I mean, I've already covered that one. He shows, someone touching the knives, trying to assist his mother. And that snitch that provided information about him, well, there's an important episode on that in the show Interrogation. Bruce Lisker was placed in something called a snitch tank, where they were trying to extract information out of people, and the people who were able to extract the information were able to exchange that in return for getting a lighter sentence. But there was something else, though. Those bloody footprints. And they began to investigate closer and closer. And here's something in the Daily News article. The investigation also found that a bloody print located in the house was not made by Bruce Lisker's shoe, but it appeared to match a shoe impression on the woman's head, referring to Dorka Lisker. Yes, there was a footprint that was on her head. And I believe it was actually Andrew Monsu who testified at the trial, saying that he wasn't a shoe print expert, but he could see the similarities between said shoe print that they just referenced and the footprints that had belonged to Bruce Lisker, but that was also something that was incorrect. Now, I'm really quite divided on this because I was introduced to this case because of a fictionalized dramatization, the show Interrogation, and in that one, I was left with this constant back and forth. Well, did he actually do it or not? Very entertaining to watch. Very entertaining to watch. Except for that final episode at the end, I have some critical things to say about it in terms of a TV drama. However, this isn't really about, how I feel about a TV drama. I save that stuff for the bonus podcast on Instagram. But there was something that I was constantly wrestling with. Did he actually do this or not? In the fictionalized TV drama, I was so on the fence because, believe it or not, the thing that made the most sense to me for the show Interrogation, going through these real things step by step, is that multiple killers angle, that there were 2 of them. This guy, I mean, whether their names are Eric Fisher and Chris Keller in the show, the real life counterparts are Bruce Lisker and John Michael Ryan, that these 2 people would have done it together, and then they would have obtained the money out of Dorka Lisker's purse, and then John Michael Ryan would have been in possession of the money and left, and because it was his mother's house, Bruce Lisker still would have had access to his belongings. He could have changed his clothes. That completely changes the angle of the blood spatter, maybe even different shoes, and that's why you're going to see some different types of prints. However, and this is a big however, I had to have an absolute denial of that. You know, one of those days when you're just kind of sitting around drinking coffee and you're trying to like figure out, well, how the murder mystery is going to end, the one that you're watching on the television. And I was like, wait a second, that makes no sense at all. Two people are going to murder somebody for drug money, and then one of them is just going to entrust the other person with the drug money and the evidence. Okay, hey, yeah, I'm going to talk the cops out of this and I'll see you later. Of course, people think that they're slick. Of course, people think they can talk their way out of anything, and they're going to be putting on this type of performance. If they're so desperate that they need drug money that badly, yet they're just going to part ways and, hey, I'm going to put on a show for the cops and I'll see you later tonight, and you're going to give me my equal share, right? Oh, yes, because people who commit crimes and people who are desperate for drug money are so honest and reliable all the time. That theory made no sense. And, so that's another strike against a multiple killers angle with Bruce Lisker and John Michael Ryan working together. And I was alluding to it throughout the beginning parts of this episode that if somebody murdered Dorka Lisker, you don't have to zone in on a single killer theory. And they even talk about this in the show Interrogation, that just because um, Bruce Lisker wasn't the only person there, it doesn't mean that there wasn't some type of multiple killers operation. Or just because you would find evidence from another person, it doesn't mean that that person acted alone. He could have been an active participant in the murder. But as I just laid out that scenario, that makes no sense at all. And a key point that is also pointed out is if this whole plan was to steal money, well, where did the money end up? And if it's about stealing money that is going to be used to obtain drugs, yet Bruce Lisker is still at the house and the money isn't present, doesn't that suggest that somebody else had been involved with the crime? In terms of a fictionalized TV show, I mean, you really have to differentiate the character that they created, named Eric Fisher, versus the real life Bruce Lisker. If I can talk just for a second about the fictional character, um, I I would put him in a category of a way that the YouTuber John Lorden described Jack McCulloch, the guy who's the suspect in the murder of Maria Ridulph, when he said, I don't know why, I can't tell you how, but I still think that he did it. With the real-life Bruce Lisker and the story that we've been talking about now, I do get somewhat of a suspicion like that, but it's only about 2%. 98% tells me that he did not commit the crime because of those reasons that we just laid off. The detectives lied about being able to see into the living room, which is a relatively easy thing to do when you think about that, to look through a dining room window or to look through a living room window. And I mean, you must have been around some type of window at some point in your life. If you get a little bit closer, you can usually see through it. Um, I mean, that's how reflections work, more or less, unless it's completely mirrored, which most windows in homes are not. And then the other point is that that other footprint that they just mentioned, that is even pressed against the head of Dorka Lisker, well, that is also from someone was not who was not Bruce Lisker. I think that is an extremely, extremely damning piece of evidence for somebody else that highly shows that he was not the only person in the house that time. Yes, of course, Bruce Lisker was there. He was the one who rescued his mother. And if it is true that he did not commit this crime, once again, absolutely tragic and saddening thing to experience. But if Bruce Lisker is innocent, and hypothetically, let's look at that example, does that mean that John Michael Ryan has to be the person that murdered Dorka Lisker? Does it have to be him? And the answer to that is absolutely not. And the show Interrogation also wanted to put forward several other theories which were somewhat implausible. Was it someone who was connected to the drug trade, or was this some type of botched robbery about breaking into a safe? And those things also are a little bit more far out, but I think they were just trying to show that maybe sometimes a true crime theory can be lost to history. However, I think, though, that at this point, it's very important to cite or it's very important to say that almost certainly Bruce Lisker's rights were violated, and should he have ever spent an ounce of time in jail? No, because I'm not a lawyer, but in America, you have the right to a fair trial. And if you have people like detectives who are falsifying evidence, then they are not allowing you to have a fair trial. As there's this scene in the movie, excuse me, it's not a movie. There's a scene in this TV show, Interrogation, where the fictional counterpart of Bruce Lisker asks for a lawyer, and he isn't given one immediately. As I said, as someone who's not an attorney, but just watches stuff on TV, and I've never been interrogated by the police myself. However, as I understand, if someone even mentions the possibility of wanting a lawyer, they're supposed to stop all forms of interrogation and provide the person with a lawyer, even if they say something as simple as, "Should I talk to a lawyer about this? Is now the time to ask for an attorney?" If they even say the hint of wanting legal counsel to be present with them in an interrogation room, then the interrogation needs to cease immediately. But that's coming from the dramatization rather than some of the other sources that I was citing. So, I mean, I think that that is 100% crystal clear. Bruce Lisker's rights were violated, and ultimately he was given a settlement for wrongful imprisonment, which I believe was $7.6 million. And that was after he was released from prison in 2009. He was this crime took place in 1983, and then Bruce Lisker was apprehended, taken into police custody, ended up spending 26 years in prison, and released from prison in 2009. And I would really like to thank the Los Angeles Times for all the articles that they had on this case, as well as providing us with the images that you've been seeing here. Many of them are from the LA Times. And then another point to mention about John Michael Ryan is I would like to call him the prime suspect, but it's really hard to say so because he has not been charged with a crime. And another reason that John Michael Ryan was not charged with the murder of Dorka Lisker is he went on to commit suicide. So, as saddening as this is, it does further the case for his own mental instability. And right now, I would like to go over to something that is a little bit more, I guess you would just call it a piece of harder documentation, and this is from FindLaw.com, caselaw.findlaw.com actually, and this is from the Circuit Court of Appeals and March 20th, 2015, and they're going to have some introductory notes. First, about the murder of Dorka Lisker. Dorka Lisker was murdered in her home in Sherman Oaks, California, sometime during the morning of March 10, 1983. She was stabbed multiple times in the back and suffered a blow to the head. Dorka's 17-year-old son, Bruce, was at the house when paramedics and police officers arrived. He was taken to the Van Nuys station where he was interviewed by Detective Andrew Monsu. During the interview, Lisker claimed that he had arrived at his parents' home between 10:30 and 11 a.m. When no one answered the front door, Lisker walked through a muddy area into the backyard, looked through a living room window, and saw a pair of feet on the floor. He then went to a sliding glass door and he saw the feet belonged to his mother, who was lying motionless on the floor. After unsuccessfully searching for a spare key, Lisker attempted to enter the house through the kitchen window, and first, we should say he removed those glass panes, and then he ran back to the car to retrieve pliers, remove the screen and the glass panes, and entered the house. Inside, he found his mother on the living room floor with 2 knives in her back. Lisker removed the knives and searched for an intruder, and he called paramedics who arrived approximately at 11:35 p.m. Now, in the harder, or I guess I should say in the non-fiction sources, Dorka Lisker would go on to pass away at around 3 p.m. in the afternoon. This is totally, I guess you'd say it's somewhat of a going off on a tangent, but in the dramatization, the fictional show Interrogation, they put forward this one theory as one of the characters' theories that he found a document in the file that said if she had been stabbed the way they said, she would have passed away within 15 minutes. However, when the paramedics had arrived, she was still alive. But meaning that was suggesting that Eric Fisher, the fictional counterpart to Bruce Lisker, must have committed the murder, and then called it in immediately. So by the time the paramedics arrived, she was still alive. However, Dorka Lisker didn't pass away until 3 p.m. And so if he called at approximately around 11:35 a.m., you see that's more than 3 hours later. That is just a fictional additive that must have been thrown in to the show. Okay, let's go back to that case law website. Detectives Monsu and Howard Langren were assigned to investigate the Lisker homicide. They maintained a murder book containing their notes, investigative reports, photographs of the scene. The murder book included a follow-up investigation report dated March 13th, 1983 that was provided to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. The report states that on the day of the murder, the detectives attempted to look into all the windows and to the rear of the house without getting their faces against the glass, but because of a glare from the sun, coupled with the patio furniture partially covered with a roll-up cover canvas, they could not see in. And I think we've covered that one. That just is blatantly false. I mean, you can watch the episode of 48 Hours, you can watch other recreations of that, and we've also, I think we've cleared that up, that that is possible to see through a window, as shocking as that is. On March 14th of 1983, Bruce Lisker was charged with the murder of his mother. Bonsu testified several weeks later at a juvenile detention hearing that the day of the murder was very bright and sunny, clear skies, very, very bright, and that he was unable to see through the back windows. I'm going to skip ahead a little because a lot of it is simply talking about windows. Now, the next part is the prosecution argued that Lisker was guilty because only his footprints were found in and around the house, and because Lisker had lied during his interview with Monsu, including a most condemning lie about seeing his mother through the window. Well, you can hear that those points aren't completely correct. However, though, initially, or at one point, Bruce Lisker did plead guilty to the crime. And this was because he was supposed to be sentenced to a juvenile detention facility to be out of prison when he was 25, or out of the facility, the detention center, when he was 25. So he pled guilty, but instead that didn't happen, and he was sent to be tried as an adult. So then he withdrew the plea for being guilty, and ultimately he was sentenced to 16 to life. And the long story short is, 26 years later, he got out of prison in 2009, but of course there were things like parole hearings and other attempts. However, I think you can get the idea. So the next source I would like to go over to is one that is called courthousenews.com. This is one that I had never heard before. I had never heard of before. This was the first time I ever read an article from them. And I'm going to jump right into the middle because they sort of give some insight into how the state or detective, sometimes a prosecutor, will not back down from the person that they have their sights on. And it says here, though California insisted that Lisker was still their man, the state opted not to retry him. This is after he was released from prison. I think they were given the option to conduct a new trial, but you can hear that again. Though California insisted that Lisker was not their man, the state opted not to retry him, and Lisker filed a civil complaint that December. The judge presiding over that case advanced only Lisker's falsification of evidence claim and his municipal liability claim, known as a Monell claim. Andrew Monsu and Landgren appealed after the court denied them absolute witness immunity concerning the investigative materials Lisker accuses them of falsifying. There are numerous things in there that the detectives, particularly Andrew Monsu, could have falsified. Also, Monsu met with John Michael Ryan and talked about checking into that motel that we said at 11 a.m., but then it turned out he had checked in at 3 p.m., so it throws his alibi completely out of whack, as well as how did he get the money for it? That part we did already say. The Ninth Circuit affirmed Friday that immunity from pre-testimony conducted is not limitless. Writing for a three-member panel, Judge Andrew Hurwitz cited rulings in similar cases by sister circuits that distinguish between conspiracies to testify falsely, which are immune, and manufacturing a false tape-recorded interview and providing hush money to would-be witnesses, which are not. Now, the point is, though, even if there is, it's almost irrelevant what type of conspiracy could have taken place, or how the detectives would have fabricated evidence, or how the detectives would have violated his rights, or how anybody would have, because the fact of the matter is someone still would have violated Bruce Lisker's rights, and then that would have meant that he did not get a fair trial. That much seems clear as day. I think there's always going to be somewhat of a mystery in who was involved with the murder of Dorka Lisker. I don't think it's very straightforward, but what also seems to be the case is John Michael Ryan cannot be excluded. He seems like an extraordinarily likely suspect. And yes, of course, could somebody have been an associate of either one of them and committed the murder based on information that they had obtained? Oh, well, she gets this amount of money for groceries every week. This person has $150 around. Could somebody have obtained that information from them, and then Dorka Lisker simply interrupted a robbery, and then Bruce Lisker shows up later on and gets all the evidence? Or, well, he becomes the centerpiece of all the contaminations of evidence, touching her bloody clothes, putting his hands on the knives. Yes, something like that may be possible, and it's quite also possible that John Michael Ryan has taken this case to the grave, and whatever he knew about the case has gone with him. But if you've followed the show Interrogation, I would love to know what you think. Do you think that he was guilty or not? Either Bruce Lisker or Eric Fisher, the fictional counterpart. And I think I've said very clearly my stance on the subject. The TV show leaves some room open for discussion. However, in real life, highly, highly, highly unlikely that Bruce Lisker actually committed this murder, because I think that's something else that we need to reinforce. No matter which way you spin it, any murder angle involving Bruce Lisker, it does not make sense. If he's trying to steal the money, well, where did that end up? Oh, I mean, wouldn't it even make more sense to just get out of there? Or especially if you're going to be using it for drugs. I mean, one thing I do know about drug addicts is they don't want to simply sit around and wait for 9 hours to score their next batch of dope. So that also is completely ridiculous that he would just steal the money, hide it, call the police, and put on a show. No, I mean, anytime you're going to examine this angle of Bruce Lisker being an active participant in these crimes, you're going to encounter some type of complication, or something isn't quite adding up. And if you do watch the show Interrogation on Paramount Plus, I think they really highlighted that. They really showed that very clearly. Any theory that you're putting forward is simply not making a whole lot of sense, or other than that John Michael Ryan was the single perpetrator, that he showed up, he tried to force his way in the house, or perhaps he even got caught breaking into the house, said he's just looking for something to drink, and the argument ensues. Someone strikes somebody with a Little League trophy, and then someone grabs two knives, not to mention all of his history of violence. That does appear to be the most logical and plausible solution, and then Bruce Lisker shows up later on and contaminates the evidence, or gets the blood onto his clothes. I shouldn't say contaminate, that's the wrong word, excuse me. It's that he gets the blood on his hands. But is this just a case of mistaken identity? Now I'll turn it over to you. And if you're curious about the show Interrogation, it's available on Paramount Plus. They have an episode of 48 Hours about Bruce Lisker on YouTube that you can watch for free. It's been uploaded here, as well as other podcast discussions. And Bruce Lisker has a website, simply brucelisker.com, which you can follow along with everything that he is now doing, and any of the other articles that I've cited throughout here. Especially if you want to, you can go through the articles written by the LA Times. All right, well, that's all for me now. Thank you to everybody who has listened to this Anything Goes segment on Friday. And if you like what you hear, you can hit the like button, as well as subscribe, notification bell, all of that stuff. And if you also think that someone else might want to be a fan of true crime programs, you can share with your friends and family, anyone who you think might want to hear something like this. And BlackBoxNet88 for the bonus podcast. You can also write me at the DMs on Instagram, BlackBoxNet88 one more time, as well as the email address, BlackBoxOnlineRadio@AOL.com. And in the description box, there's a link to the Facebook page. Okay, that's all for me. See you on Instagram for the bonus podcast. Until next time.